Hello, my name is Janice Gibson. Welcome to the fourth week of Advent. I hope as Christmas is drawing nearer, you are finding yourself drawing closer to God and His goodness. Over these last 3 weeks, we have looked at the song, Joy to the World. We have made more room in our hearts for God. We have learned how to live our lives with joy, and we have relished the many blessings that are ours through Jesus Christ. This week, we look at the fourth and final verse of Joy to the World, words that hold so much meaning. He rules the world with truth and grace, and makes the nations prove the glories of His righteousness and wonders of His love. It is the wonders of God's love that I would like us to focus on in this last week of Advent. Wonder can be described as a great feeling of admiration or pleasure over something beautiful. If we study God's love, we do see something that is quite beautiful and worthy of great admiration. God's love is agape love. Agape is a Greek word representing the highest form of love. It is a pure and willful love that is based on no conditions. Agape love chooses to put others before itself. When we hear the favored Bible verse, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son," we see agape love. God's love given freely to us without restrictions. The parable of the Good Samaritan is another wonderful illustration of agape love. The Good Samaritan is traveling, yet sees a man by the side of the road who has been beaten and hurt and needs help. So the Good Samaritan stops. He puts this man and his needs before himself, and he makes sure that this man is going to be okay and is going to have everything he needs before the Good Samaritan continues on his way. If we put ourselves in the shoes of that man by the side of the road, and we understand what it would feel like to have someone come and attend to us out of the goodness and compassion in their heart, we know how good that would feel. And we begin to understand a little bit more about what God's love truly is. Let's also take a look at God's love through the famous love verses that are in 1 Corinthians 13. Let's look at each of these verses through God's love. God's love is patient. God's love is kind. God's love is not jealous or boastful. God's love does not brag and is not proud or arrogant. God's love is not rude. God's love does not get irritated. God's love is not happy about injustice, but God's love rejoices in the truth. God's love bears all things. God's love believes all things. God's love hopes all things. God's love endures all things. God's love never fails. We know God's love, and we can begin to understand it. But how can we understand it a bit more deeply? And how can we remember that great love when we are in the midst of our busy lives? I have 3 objects that I would like us to look at to help us see God's love a little bit more clearly. The first thing I have is a ribbon. We see a lot of ribbons this time of year decorating packages. Ribbons are very useful for tying things together, keeping things close together, putting them in their proper place. If we think of God's love like a ribbon, God's love pulls us close. God's love keeps us with him. God's love puts us in the best possible place to be. So remember that ribbon of love that is keeping you right where you need to be, in his love. Something else that we see quite a bit this time of year is a blanket, because it is so chilly. Blankets are very nice. They can cover us completely. They give us comfort and warmth. And when we've been under them for a while, we begin to generate our own heat. So if we think about this blanket related to God's love, his love covers us completely, inside and outside, spiritually and physically. God's love gives us so much comfort, makes us feel so good. And when we take time to really soak in his love, we begin to generate even more love that we can share with others. The last thing I would like to show you is an ornament. But it's the ornament's shape that I want you to pay close attention to. This is shaped like a ball. This ball has no beginning, no ending. It just keeps going and going and going. Just like God's love. God's love is always there. It's constant, overflowing, never ending. Now, I don't know if you're silly like me, but I find a certain special satisfaction in opening a brand new bar of soap or a new box of cereal. There's just some kind of security it gives me to know that I'm not going to have to go out and buy those things for a while, that they're going to last, they're going to be there for a while. And we can think about that with God's love as well. His love is never going to run out. It is always there. It is always brand new, in abundant supply. There is never a moment that we are unloved. So the wonders of God's love are unending. I've mentioned a few here, but if you have time over the next few days to meditate upon God's love, there may be other thoughts, ideas, and understandings that come to you. But as you see ribbons this season, remember God's love drawing you close. And as you curl up with your blankets, remember God's love holding you and comforting you and making you feel so good. And as you look at ornaments or balls, remember that God's love is never ending. I'd like to close with a prayer that was printed in a Grace Bulletin several years ago. It was one that held so many special words that I wanted to keep it. So I clipped it out and I read it quite often. Loving Jesus, strong shepherd, your love for us reaches from the cradle to the grave. There is no place or time or situation in which we are cut off from you. Remind us of that love whenever we doubt our own worth. Forgive us for finding life boring or predictable when you have placed us in a garden of love. Turn our lives around and surprise us with grace and joy. Keep us forever amazed at your love. Amen.